my presentation is yet again something different to that from Stephen and Craig. So I'll launch in, and I promise I won't dwell on French philosophers for too long. But I'm very obedient in the sense that I have drawn out 3 key ideas that I wanted to look at in response to the provocation for tonight's seminar. I realise, though, that I have not been obedient in that I haven't really dwelt on the skills that are needed. So maybe that's something we can bring out through the Q&A at the end. Idea 1 is around the idea of the role of GLAM institutions in collective memory. So by their very nature, GLAMs both represent and influence collective memory, and that's what Craig was talking about. I think we're in agreement. What I would argue is that as Australian government institutions, the national collecting institutions, of which the NFSA, Archives, Library and Museum are all a part, have a particularly unique responsibility to make an open and honest representation, and we do this through our collecting and sharing activity. In his 1995 work, Archive Fever, philosopher Jacques Derrida traces the concept of the modern archive back to the Greek word arche, and my apologies for pronunciation, but arche meaning commencement, commandment, or beginning. So he argues that in antiquity, and bear with me, I won't dwell, archives were based in a space which also housed lawmakers. So the archive was both a collection, but also a place of law or authority. So in Derrida's view, it was this origin which has influenced the development of the modern archive, and its role as both a describer, so reflecting human memory through a collection, and a prescriber of human memory. So particularly for the NCIs, I would argue, the archive or the museum, library or gallery is seen as a source of truth. So how does this play out for the NFSA and for the other NCI siblings? The institutions of my colleagues here tonight and the other NCIs operating at the Australian government level. We're all tasked with building collections that reflect the shared national memory. The subject matter or the formats we're tasked with collecting might differ, but the remit or the focus is essentially the same. This particular role isn't unusual amongst the GLAM sector, but it's our status as Australian government institutions which makes us particularly unique. The nature of our collections are, by deed of our role as Australian government agencies, seen as reflecting the Australian nation, providing a stamp of authority or legitimacy. So this might be a slightly too literal translation of the Derrida view, and my apologies for that, for those of you who know Derrida well. But it's this status that gives us what we collect and how we present it a particular significance. And with that comes a great responsibility at each step of our collecting activity. So for the NFSA and for my colleagues here, there are a number of critical decision points through which we reflect and can influence the Australian collective memory and how we present that. So firstly and most obviously as a collector, the NFSA is Australia's national audiovisual archive. Like the archives, the library and the museum, we're established by federal legislation. Our unique remit is to collect, preserve and share a collection of Australian audiovisual heritage. Unlike the archives and the library, and like the museum, ours is an entirely curated collection. So our collecting activity isn't the result of legal deposit or legislated record keeping. The National Audiovisual Collection numbers about 3.3 million items. It tells the story of Australia's creative audiovisual output from the earliest recordings in every format of audiovisual output created. Each item in our collection represents a decision made by a curator about its significance at a point in time. So this, I think, is really an important point. The role of the curator in a curated collection is absolutely vital. Their knowledge of the collection itself, the significance of the material, the stories that relate to it, and the nature of the creator of that material and the context in which it was created. I'll use as an example COVID-19 collecting. As we know too well during the shutdown, and I know Craig has just used some great examples from social media and how people were collecting online. One of the dangers of this type of interaction is how fleeting the interactions are. it's important they're not lost. And the NFSA's curators were mindful of that in bringing together a selection of news, screen content and social media posts that together told the story of that experience during the lockdown and the continued pandemic across Australia. In making those decisions about what to bring into the collection, it's important that not only were they mindful of what people were appreciating at the time, but how that material and how that collection will be interpreted in future years. At the same time, they were referencing material coming into other NCI collections so that together those collections formed a whole, a picture of that experience across Australia. The second way in which we influence the collective memory is as an interpreter of the collection. So embedded in the NFSA's role is a requirement to share and provide access, and that's not unique to us. And I know amongst all of the NCIs, we share that responsibility. As with our collecting activity, decisions about what is important in the collection and what deserves supported storytelling and how to tell that story are critical. These decisions aren't made lightly or in isolation. So in deciding how to, and what to share, we make reference to national and international events, to the activities of other institutions, other NCIs at the federal level, and obviously to the collection itself. Sometimes the stories we bring up are difficult, and it brings up what are confronting and complex issues in the collection. And it's important that we navigate these stories carefully and with sensitivity to the particular cultural or social issues at play. Finally, the touch point in which we interpret and influence the collective memory is as an educator. The NCIs have always had a role in providing educational programs, and the NFSA isn't unique. We've always been a provider of education for students and for adult learners. But with digital media comes an increase in the availability of misinformation. The role of the archives is shifting in line with this, and we are seeing a new opportunity for us to work on the education around media literacy. In this space, the NFSA is a founding member of the Australian Media Literacy Alliance, and through this forum, we're working to develop a national media literacy strategy. So idea 2 is around the challenges of funding and the opportunity that our collections present in making that case. So while the government funding environment is increasingly challenging, I think the fact that we all have cultural collections that tell the national story is a great opportunity. The trick for us all, and what we've seen in Stephen's presentation, is how to make that case. So the reality is that funding is increasingly constrained. I'm aware that as NCIs, we have a relative security of ongoing funding, but we're also tied into a broad collecting remit with fixed overheads and increasing costs. What we've seen in recent years is digital transformation has also meant an explosion in collecting activity. So we're now managing both analogue and digital collections and analogue and digital infrastructure. At the same time, we also face the need to digitise our deteriorating analogue material. So as with Stephen and the NAA's success this year, last year the NFSA was successful in receiving additional funding of 5.5 million from the Australian Government to digitise our at-risk audiovisual material. So you heard Stephen talk about Deadline 2025, which relates to material held on magnetic tape. So that includes, for example, VHS tapes and material from that time that is relatively unstable. And we think if not digitised by 2025, won't be usable and will be lost forever. We've been working since that time on upscaling our digitisation activity, and we think we're now on track to meet the challenge of Deadline 2025, which is great news. It's interesting though, that case, when we look at the NFSA's success in gaining funding last year and the NAA this year. Over time, we've made many cases to government about our funding pressures, but it's the risk to the collective memory which has clearly resonated most in recent years. The very real fact that our shared creative content may be lost or no longer accessible has captured the public imagination and the imagination of decision makers, and it's provided an imperative for support. So the trick for us, and what we are all grappling with, as Stephen said, is tapping into that, finding the stories that will really resonate. For the NFSA, we're aware that, you know, as an archive of film and sound material, we hold a lot of material that has a deep emotional connection for people. And Stephen gave us some great examples of how finding material that just has that connection is really important in the decision-making process. So the third idea is around digital transformation. It's both presenting us with a challenge, but also a significant opportunity to reflect and to influence the collective memory. The scale of collecting in particular that we have seen over the last decade is immense. The quantity of content that is being generated and which is relevant to our remits has exponentially increased. At the same time, we're still collecting analogue material, and as I mentioned earlier, now grappling with the challenges of managing two collections. We're not unique in this challenge, but obviously our approach is something that we are trying to address in the particular context of the NFSA. For the NFSA, I mentioned digitisation earlier. We're well on track to have our collection digitised, but we have another major body of work underway to support our digital workflows. So that's the processes that sit behind our institution to manage a large-scale digital collection, which we can store and share with the Australian public. One of our major challenges in this space is about managing the material itself. So in 2019, the NFSA broadened its remit to include video games in our collecting activity. We formalised an agreement with the Australian Centre of Moving Image in Melbourne and the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences in Sydney on a national approach to preserving Australian games output. Some of the practical considerations in this space are around how we work together to collect games, how we make sure we're not duplicating our efforts, and how we work with Australian creators strategically. We're also looking at ways in which we can automate the process of bringing digital media into the collection. So ironically, in managing digital media, we still have a lot of manual processes in the workflow, and we are working on ways to reduce this and free curators up to curate. Finally, digital access is a major opportunity, and particularly for an institution like the NFSA with an audiovisual collection that lends itself to remote delivery, and particularly for a population that is at home and online. So one of our focuses over the next while will be on the development of an access platform and looking at how we can make sure that our digitised collection, when it's available, actually can be accessed online. So in summary, it's my view that GLAMs have a significant responsibility to both reflect and interpret the collective memory, but that this is amplified for the NCIs, and we need to be particularly careful about our collecting activity as a result. There's a great responsibility that comes with that. The nature of the collections provides an opportunity to build the narrative for support. There's a deep emotional opportunity in our collection material. And digital transformation has thrown up significant challenges, but also presents an opportunity to amplify our collecting and sharing activity and to represent and influence the collective memory. Thank you.